Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We have a Latin trifecta for you this week. 3 guests shedding light on the culture, economics, and politics of our southern neighbors. Later in the show, we'll be joined by 10-time Grammy-winning jazz master and Cuban expat Arturo Sandoval, as well as Alejandro Chafuen, president of Atlas Networks. Up first, we'd like to welcome Yale professor of religion and history Carlos Eire, winner of the National Book Award for his memoir, Waiting for Snow in Havana, Confessions of a Cuban Boy. Carlos, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me on the show.
Carlos, you were one of 14,000 unaccompanied children rescued from Cuba and brought to America in 1961 by what came to be called Operation Pedro Pan. Your academic career and research into the intellectual, religious, and cultural history of late medieval and early modern Europe speaks for itself, and maybe another time we can talk about that. But I asked you on today to reflect on the current rapprochement with Cuba through the eyes of someone who lived through Castro's communist takeover and escaped before your soul was crushed. Describe Cuba before Castro.
Yeah, well, of course, my perspective is that of a child, but children can be perceptive too. My earliest memories, of course, are from the 1950s before Fidel took over. And Cuba at that time was, I can say, a lot like the United States in almost every respect. When I came to the U.S. in 1962, I felt like I'd gone back to Cuba in the 1950s. It was a very prosperous place, immensely prosperous. But politically, it was still very immature. There was a lot of corruption. We had a man as president who had taken over in a military coup, Fulgencio Batista, who had actually been president once before, elected president, and then came back and took over. He had a very corrupt administration and was tough on anyone who tried to oppose him. But there was relative freedom of the press, relative freedom of speech. But of course, by the time my memories become really vivid was the late 50s, and there were many, many Cubans trying to oust Batista.
Castro apologists speak of the horrors of the Batista regime and describe the similarities and differences between the two dictators.
Batista did have torture chambers, and sometimes people would disappear and show up dead. But the numbers, compared to Fidel Castro's numbers, are so small in comparison. The prison system under Batista didn't grow. There weren't many new prisons created. Under Fidel Castro, hundreds of new prisons had to be created. And there were exiles, people who fled. Batista came mostly here to the U.S. There was a long history of Cubans doing that anytime a dictator was in power. And the whole point of coming to the U.S. was, of course, to put something together to go back to Cuba and oust the tyrant. As a matter of fact, that's what Fidel did. But the level of repression under Fidel, and I know they love to paint Batista as some kind of monster. And Hollywood has helped give Americans that impression, certainly. But the amount of cruelty and violence unleashed by Fidel Castro was off the charts, especially when compared to Batista.
Your memoir, Waiting for Snow in Havana, speaks of the disappointment of many of the revolutionaries who helped Castro overthrow Batista. Tell us about that.
Fidel Castro was only one of several revolutionary leaders. He was not the only one. And his fighters were in the eastern end of the island. There were, over a dozen groups fighting against Batista, including the university students. Their group was the one that actually stormed the presidential palace, and it came within feet of the room in which Batista was hiding. But they were wiped out. And as soon as Fidel claimed the top dog status, within 2 weeks of Batista leaving, so this is January 1959, within 2 weeks, he started eliminating all the other groups, shutting them out of power, not appointing people to positions of power from those other groups. And worse than that, started appointing communists, members of the Cuban Communist Party, to top posts. immediately there was dissension within his own ranks, and definitely in the ranks of the other groups that had fought very hard to oust Batista. So within the first year, so we're talking 1959, the entire year, it just kept getting worse and worse in terms of the access to power, that anyone who wasn't on Fidel's side would be shut out.
Powerful narratives and slogans are often the key to mass manipulation. Describe the Fidel, this house is yours poster campaign.
Yeah, well, Fidel was greeted with great enthusiasm because he promised elections. He promised to restore democracy. And the media portrayed him as almost a kind of savior. I remember one image that had a kind of a halo around his head. But there was a poster that suddenly started to appear in people's windows. Fidel, this is your house. Fidel, esta es tu casa. I don't remember the exact month when that started showing up, but boy, it was everywhere. And it's kind of an ironic poster because within a year or so of that poster appearing, all private property was abolished. So, and really everyone's house did become Fidel's house. So, yeah, there was a lot of support for him initially, but from what I was able to observe among the adults in my family and friends of my family, was that those who were enthusiastic about Fidel, their enthusiasm cooled very, very quickly.
I understand Che Guevara had a beautiful mansion just 3 blocks from your house and a chauffeured Mercedes-Benz to ride around in. How did the Cuban people square the luxurious lifestyles and possessions of the communist leadership, just as their own houses, property, and bank accounts were being seized?
Well, of course, people who could see this kind of hypocrisy immediately saw it for what it was. But the vast majority of Cubans were shielded from these details. I just happened to live 3 blocks from one of the houses he appropriated for himself. I remember it as huge. It was almost half a city block or an entire city block is how I remember it, with a very tall fence and gates. Most Cubans didn't get to see that. But Che, he kept dressing in his fatigues, and he had a reputation for not bathing very often, too. So most Cubans didn't see that. Most Cubans didn't see where the leaders lived. To this day, it's pretty much a secret where they live and how they live.
A big part of the Castro story revolves around agrarian reform. How did that work?
The agrarian reform was an attempt to collectivize agricultural labor, Soviet style. Large landholders were the first to be hit. Their land holdings were chopped up and given to the people who were renting from them or working for them. But then the farmers themselves, the former renters, the people who were given smaller plots of land, were all collectivized very quickly, which meant that they couldn't sell what they produced directly. Everything that was produced went to the state, and the state assumed control of all food production. And there were some peasants who resisted this, and there were peasants who actually took up arms and fought the Castro regime. Most people don't know about this, but in the central mountains, the Escambray Mountains, there was a peasant uprising that lasted for over a year. And they were all very brutally wiped out. But of course, if you read the Castro literature on this event, they are described as mercenaries or brigands. They're presented as people who were in control of the elites, the former elites. But in fact, these were very humble peasants who didn't like the whole collective business.
I understand Castro took over the Coca-Cola plant, but somehow didn't get his hands on the recipe. What happened next?
Yeah, when Castro and his friends took over all businesses, including Coca-Cola, the whole soft drink industry, including some Cuban-owned soft drink companies, they couldn't get the recipes. Coke and Pepsi and everything else, they kept bottling it, but they all tasted horrible. And Che Guevara actually said on television to the whole nation, yeah, you can keep drinking this crap if you want to, but it's never going to taste the same. So,
I guess that's a metaphor for all of Cuba, huh?
Yeah. They thought they could reinvent all the recipes, ex nihilo, from nothing, and come up with something better. But in fact, I don't know when it was that they finally stopped trying to bottle the old drinks with the familiar names because the taste was so awful. And like everything else, too, everything became rationed. So you couldn't just go and have a soft drink if you wanted one. There wasn't enough stuff to go around.
Carlos, the words "Pardon" shouted by mobs echo loudly through your memoir of your childhood in Cuba. What was that all about?
During the first few months of Fidel taking over the government, anyone who had had connections to the Batista regime, and many people who actually had no connection to the Batista regime but were viewed as enemies, were all lined up and shot against some wall. Most of the executions took place at La Cabaña Fortress at the entrance to Havana Harbor. And the man in charge of those executions was Che Guevara, who quite often administered the coup de grace. And actually, eyewitness accounts, there are so many of them. He actually seemed to take great pleasure in blowing people's brains out after they had been riddled with bullets.
Why do you figure he's still on the front of many college kids' T-shirts?
Oh, because the myth-making has been very effective. He's portrayed as some kind of freedom fighter. But in fact, he's just the opposite. He was a psychopathic mass murderer who took immense joy in hurting other people. And you try telling that to anyone who's wearing a T-shirt, and I've done that many times, and I get the same response. Oh, well, no, I have him on the shirt here because he's a freedom fighter. The propaganda spewed by the Castro regime has been immensely successful.
I understand executions were regularly broadcast on TV when you were a kid.
I remember seeing. There are still some, if you look online and you Google execution Cuba, you'll see a couple of clips of people getting their brains blown out by a firing squad. It's all very disturbing. What they did televise regularly were the so-called trials of these people, in which they didn't have a chance to defend themselves or have an attorney or a real trial. And the mob would start chanting, to the wall, paredon, paredon, paredon. And it was a rhythmic chant. And to this day, anytime I go to a large event like a ball game, see the whole crowd shouting something, I have a traumatic experience. It's like a PTSD, right? It just scares me to hear a crowd shouting something in unison, and it doesn't matter what it is, but it immediately brings me back to this.
Your older cousin Fernando was part of the resistance and was caught transporting weapons in the trunk of his car. What became of him?
My cousin Fernando was involved in the pre-Bay of Pigs preparation. The plan for the Bay of Pigs was for the men to land and then Cubans to rise up and fight everywhere through the island. And my cousin Fernando was involved with a group that was moving weapons from one place to another. He got caught. He spent 20-some-odd years in prison. He had a 30-year sentence, but he really was supposed to be shot and executed, but they couldn't do that because he had been born in Spain, and the Spanish diplomats in Cuba got his sentence commuted to 30 years in prison. He got out about 10 years early. And he's still alive. He lives in Puerto Rico. And he doesn't talk about his prison experience. He doesn't like to.
I understand it was standard practice to subject prisoners to mock firing squads, without them, of course, knowing that they were mock. How did that work?
They'd pull you out to shoot you, and they'd shoot blanks at you. And they could do that repeatedly. They did it to my cousin Fernando. And also his father, my uncle, was also in prison with him. And many, many mornings, they'd wake up my uncle and say, when you hear the shots outside, that's going to be your son. And it's a form of psychological torture that I don't think has been talked about. I haven't seen many books or articles that mention this, but it was very, very common.
Once the reality of communism sunk in, why is it that the Cuban people never mustered the courage to put a bullet in Castro's head? Well,
that's a great question. And I often try to come up with an answer. I have no answer. The Cuban people have tried. I mean, many Cuban people did, like the peasants who rose up in the Escambray Mountains. But keep in mind, this is Cold War time that we're talking about, 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. And with the Soviet support, the repression was so intense that it was very hard. At one point in the 1970s, there were so many Cubans in prison that if you look at the percentage of the population, not the sheer number, but the percentage, there was a higher percentage of the population in Castro's gulag than Russians in Stalin's gulags.
Wow.
Over 300,000 Cubans.
Why did your family decide to ship you out of the country? That must have been a gut-wrenching decision.
Yeah, and I know because my mom would always ask me, especially as she aged, did I do the right thing? I'd always say, yes, thank you very much. I thank you every day. I still thank her and my dad every day.
Describe Operation Pedro Pan and the process of spiriting children out of the country. Why did Castro allow it?
The children who got to leave through Operation Pedro Pan were sent to the U.S. by their parents so that they could escape being indoctrinated in Castro schools, or in the case of the older teenagers, being drafted into the army or being sent to the Soviet Union or Eastern European countries behind the Iron Curtain. The process was all word of mouth. This is all clandestine. But the Castro people knew about it, and they were very glad to get rid of these youths who would have been trouble later. Plus, I also had the unique chance of asking one of Castro's top men a few years ago why they just did nothing. And I got a very revealing answer. This man was Carlos Franchi. He was one of Fidel's propaganda ministers who was purged and went into exile. But he came to talk here at Yale, and I got to ask him at dinner, but you guys knew about the kids leaving. Why didn't you allow it? And he said with a big, big smile on his face, because anything that would destroy the bourgeois family was in our favor.
Interesting. You know, thousands of others escaped Cuba, many risking their lives in rickety boats and rafts. What happens to a culture when you bleed away all the courageous and ambitious people and leave only the docile and compliant behind? Can that culture ever recover its vigor and courage?
Well, I think you see what happens when you see photos from Cuba today and what a disaster it is. Basically, what happened after Castro was one of the largest brain drains, if you want to use that phrase, in the history of the Western Hemisphere. The intellectuals were chased away. The scientists were chased away. The business people were chased away. And what's left behind, with an economy completely controlled by the government, is the disaster that you see nowadays, where actually Cubans have very little fish to eat, even though they live on an island. It's against the law to own a boat or have access to a boat unless you have some very special government permit. So it doesn't matter how smart you are now in Cuba, and there's still many, bright people in Cuba, but their hands are tied. They have to do whatever the government says they can do, or they can't do what the government says they can't do. It's an absolute disaster.
50 years have passed since communism swept into Cuba, and President Obama has recently taken it upon himself to open things up. How did you feel when you saw him posing in front of a giant picture of Che Guevara?
When that picture appeared, I wasn't surprised. By that time, I was so upset. I was actually upset from the day he gave his speech on December 17th, 2014. The whole deal stinks to high heaven. Nothing but concessions to the Castro regime in exchange for zero. The United States has gotten zero out of this deal. And many people mistakenly assume that the sanctions on Cuba were intended to topple the Castro regime. But in fact, the real reason for all the sanctions was to contain the damage that the Castro regime could do in Latin America and other parts of the world. So taking Cuba off the list of terrorist states is one of the biggest mistakes made as part of this whole deal.
The Castros have long blamed the American embargo for Cuba's disastrous economy, despite the fact that they can trade with many other Western nations. and President Obama saw fit to lend legitimacy to that claim. Do you think Obama really believes that?
I think that he probably does believe some form of that argument, because his political philosophy is obviously far to the left. So I think he likes the so-called experiment, and leftists usually use that term to describe places like Cuba or Mao's China. It's an experiment. It's a noble experiment. It's as long as it's other people and not us, it's okay. But I think he really wants to help the Castro regime stay in power.
President Obama had barely left the island when Raul Castro served up a blistering speech promising that Cuba would never renounce a single communist principle. What does that portend?
The fact that the Cuban government is run by basically a dynasty, the Castro dynasty, and their helpers, they have no wish whatsoever to change anything that will limit their power and their control of the entire nation. So Obama's main objective, as I have seen it from day one, has not been to change anything in Cuba, but rather just to claim for himself the role of maverick, the one president who went against 5 decades of policy, which he kept saying and keeps saying to this day, it didn't work, overlooking the fact that the policies were in place to contain the Castro regime, not to topple it. And what he's doing now works even less. The number of Cubans fleeing Cuba has increased dramatically since his announcement in December of 2014. As a matter of fact, they're expecting such a great flood of Cubans in Texas, of all places, that they don't know where they're going to put these people. Because Cubans are fleeing now. They'll go to South American countries and work their way up through Central America. Right. And the minute they get to the U.S. border, they're welcomed.
Right. Dry foot, they're here.
Yeah, dry foot, you're in. So Texas, the figure I saw for the first 8 months of 2015, over 30,000 Cubans had come in just through the Texas border.
So, Carlos, forecast Cuba's future for us. Could democracy and freedom possibly lie ahead, or will foreign crony corporatists eager to do deals empowered, entrenched, and corrupt elites, similar to what we've seen in Russia?
I think the future for Cuba is very bleak. I'm a historian, so looking at the way things are now, looking at the way in which the European Union and the United States are dealing with Cuba, I don't see any future for it other than being one of these failed communist states where a small number of people control everything. It won't ever be China in terms of becoming an economic power. It will remain poor. It will remain repressed as long as over 1 million tourists visit every year. That's their main source of income.
Poverty tourists.
Tourism is keeping the place afloat, especially now that Venezuela is imploding. Tourism is the main source of income. As long as that continues and people blithely go there to visit some kind of socialist Jurassic Park and drop their money there, there's no future for Cuba.
Carlos, thanks for coming on the show. Our hearts go out to your former countrymen.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me on your show.
That was Yale Professor of Religion and History Carlos Eire, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. To make sure you don't miss any of our shows, stop by realclearradio.org and sign up for updates. Today's program was partially underwritten by the generous support of Old Boston Restorations, a Victorian property management company in Boston's South End. Visit them online at oldbostonrestorations.com. Ahead, we'll speak with jazz great Arturo Sandoval, one of Cuba's most famous and beloved defectors. Stay tuned.